The sun in the Wyoming Territory was not a gentle thing. It was a hammer, a smith's angry tool that beat the bleached blue sky until all the color ran thin, and it pounded the earth until it cracked. It struck the endless plains of sagebrush, turning the silver-green leaves to a dusty gray and baking the life from the soil. The land stretched out in every direction, a great tan sea of scorched earth and dry grass, indifferent to the small dramas of the creatures that crawled upon its surface. The only constant companion was the wind. It was a lonely presence, a ceaseless whisper that snaked through the brittle stalks of buffalo grass, carrying the scent of dust and the false promise of distant rain, a promise that never seemed to find its way here. The wind spoke of emptiness, of distances so vast they could swallow a person whole, leaving not even a memory behind. In this immense and unforgiving world, Elara was a small, insignificant figure, a mote of dust walking on the edge of a rutted wagon trail. She was a thing of no consequence, easily erased by the sun and the wind. She could have been no more than 20 years of age, but her face was a roadmap of hardship, etched with a deep exhaustion that made her seem ageless. The skin was pulled tight over her cheekbones, burned by the sun and chapped by the wind. Her eyes, a pale and startled blue, were sunk deep in their sockets, haunted by things seen and endured. Her dress was a collection of faded patches, the original calico pattern long lost to sun and wear, a testament to a life of making do. Her feet, which had carried her more miles than she could count, were wrapped in rags that did little to cushion them from the sharp stones and hot earth. Her body, beneath the tattered cloth, was a geography of starvation, every rib a distinct ridge, every joint a sharp angle. Every line of her posture, from the forward slump of her shoulders to the slight drag of her left foot, screamed a profound and settled defeat. Yet, she kept moving, some primal instinct for survival, a stubborn flicker deep in her core that had somehow outlasted hope, pushed one foot in front of the other. With every step, the dust puffed up around her ankles, a fine, gritty powder that coated her skin and worked its way into her lungs. Hope was a luxury she had discarded long ago, along with things like comfort, safety, and a full name spoken with kindness. Now, there was only the moving. To stop was to die. Her internal world was a storm of fear and shame, a tempest far more violent than the quiet desolation around her. Fragments of thought, sharp as broken glass, tore through her mind. A man's rough laughter, a woman's scornful gaze, the slam of a heavy door. She was fleeing a past too horrific to be given a name, a darkness that clung to her like a shroud. This past had taught her a single, brutal lesson, a truth she held as the gospel of her existence. She was tainted, unclean, fundamentally worthless. The world had looked at her and found her wanting, and she had learned to see herself through its eyes. Every glance from a stranger on the road felt like an accusation, a silent confirmation of her inner filth. Every town she passed through, every door that remained closed to her pleas for work, was another judgment, another nail in the coffin of her own damnation. She was heading west, but she had no destination. West was just a direction, a way to put miles between herself and the memories that clawed at her in the quiet moments and hunted her in her sleep. The memories were ghosts with hands, and they were always reaching for her. She had not eaten a real meal in days. A handful of tart, wild berries here, a piece of hardtack stolen from the back of a supply wagon there. It was enough to keep the body moving, but not enough to silence the gnawing pain in her belly. But that physical hunger, as sharp as it was a dull ache compared to the soul-deep hunger that consumed her. It was a craving for a single moment of peace, for a place where she could stop running, where she could set down the crushing weight of her own history and just breathe. After days of walking, when the world had begun to shimmer and swim before her eyes from the lack of water and food, she saw it, on the brink of collapse. She topped a low rise, and there, nestled in a shallow, wide valley, were the dark, solid shapes of a ranch house and a barn. A thin ribbon of gray smoke curled from a stone chimney, a fragile sign of life in the vast emptiness. The collection of buildings looked like a fortress, a bulwark built to stand against the crushing indifference of the plains. It was a place of substance and permanence in a world that felt to her like shifting dust. For Ilara, the sight was a jolt, a violent clash of two powerful emotions. It was a beacon of potential salvation, a place that might hold water, food, shelter, but it was also a source of immense and paralyzing terror. The thought of approaching, of making her presence known to the people within, of having to form words in her parched throat and endure being seen, sent a wave of acidic nausea through her. Her mind instantly replayed a litany of past failures, a reel of humiliation that was always ready to unspool. She remembered the leering eyes of men in a mining camp who saw her not as a person, but as a thing to be used. She remembered the contemptuous sneers of decent women in a small town who saw the dirt on her dress and the fear in her eyes and judged her instantly, their faces hardening into masks of righteous disgust. She remembered the doors, so many doors, slammed shut in her face, the sound of final, percussive rejection. The phrase that had defined her life repeated in her mind, a dismal chant. "No use for you here. Get along." She could not bring herself to walk toward it. Instead, she slid down the side of the rise and found a shallow ditch overgrown with sagebrush, its pungent, earthy smell filling the air. She crawled into it, her body sinking into the relative coolness of the shaded dirt, and she watched. For hours. She lay there, a frightened animal gone to ground, observing the ranch as the merciless sun began its slow descent, painting the western sky in brutal strokes of orange, purple, and blood red. She watched the rhythm of the place unfold. A few ranch hands, their forms lean and wiry, moved between the corral and the bunkhouse, the lowing of cattle. A deep and mournful sound drifted on the evening air, and she watched the lone figure of a man who moved with a heavy, deliberate gait that seemed to carry the weight of the world. He was tall, his shoulders a wide, solid line against the vibrant sky. A wide-brimmed hat hid his features from her, but she could see the way he worked. He moved with a quiet, focused intensity, wasting no motion as he repaired a section of fence, his actions precise and capable. There was a profound solitude about him that was both intimidating and, in a strange way, calming. He did not laugh or shout to the other hands. He simply worked, a part of the landscape, as solid and silent as the stones that made up his chimney. Ilara's desperation began to wage a final, decisive war against her fear. The sun disappeared, and the fierce colors of the sunset softened into the bruised tones of twilight. The gnawing in her belly had become a sharp, twisting pain. Her throat was a desert, and her head pounded with a dull, persistent rhythm. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that if she did not act, she would likely die out here. She would become another nameless casualty of the West, her bones bleached by the sun and scattered by coyotes, her story untold and unremembered. The fear of dying alone in the dark finally became greater than the fear of being seen. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, she pushed herself to her feet. Her legs trembled, and the world tilted for a moment before steadying. She began to walk towards the ranch house, her movements stiff and uncertain. As dusk settled over the valley, the world became soft and gray, the sharp edges of the land blurring into shadow. The air grew cooler. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the vast, quiet evening. Her throat was so dry, so constricted with terror, that she was not sure a sound could escape it if she tried. She reached the porch of the main house. It was made of sturdy, dark wood, built to last. A single lantern cast a warm, yellow glow from a window beside the door. She stood there for a long moment, her hand raised, unable to complete the simple act of knocking. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. She took a ragged breath, squeezed her eyes shut, and knocked. The sound was shockingly loud in the quiet evening, an explosion that seemed to echo across the entire valley. The footsteps inside were heavy, deliberate, the same gait she had watched all afternoon. The door swung inward, and the man she had seen earlier stood before her. This was Silas. Up close, he was even more imposing. He filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the light from within. His face, illuminated by the lantern light, was a landscape in itself, weathered and carved by sun and wind into stark plains and deep lines. His hair was dark, shot through with hints of gray at the temples, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a startlingly clear gray, the color of a winter sky, and they were filled with a deep, unreadable sorrow, a grief so profound it seemed to have permanently settled there. He looked at her, and his gaze was not like the others she had endured. It was not lewd or filled with immediate, contemptuous dismissal, but it was hard, guarded, and utterly devoid of welcome. It was the gaze of a man who had locked his heart in a stone vault and had no intention of opening it. His eyes took in every detail of her ragged appearance, the patched dress, the thinness of her wrists peeking from the frayed cuffs, the raw fear that made her eyes too wide in her starved face. His expression, already grim, tightened. A muscle jumped in his jaw. Ilara flinched, a small, involuntary movement, bracing herself for the inevitable. She expected him to yell, to curse her for bringing her filth to his doorstep, to tell her to leave. Her voice, when it finally came out, was a hoarse, rattling whisper. The words she had practiced in her mind for hours tumbling out in a disordered rush. "Sir, I ain't asking for a handout. Just for work. Any work. I can muck stalls. I can scrub floors. I am a hard worker. Sir, anything you got." She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed, worn toes of his leather boots, unable to bring herself to meet that hard, sorrowful gaze. To look him in the eye would be to see her own worthlessness reflected there. The silence that followed stretched out, thick and heavy with her terror and his appraisal. He said nothing. He just stood there, looking down at her, and she could feel the weight of his stare like a physical pressure. He saw all the telltale signs of a woman who had been through the worst the world had to offer, a woman who was running from something ugly. His first instinct, sharp and protective of his own hard-won solitude, was to say no, to send her away and avoid whatever trouble she was either fleeing from or might bring with her. Trouble clung to people like her, a scent that predators could follow for miles. He had enough ghosts in his house already. He did not need to invite in a living one. He opened his mouth to speak the words, the familiar words of dismissal that would send her back into the consuming wilderness. Get along, but just as he was about to shut the door, to sever this brief, unwelcome connection, he hesitated. Something in her posture held him. It was the way she held herself so tightly, her arms wrapped around her thin frame as if trying to shrink out of existence, to take up as little space in the world as possible. It was a posture of profound, ingrained apology for her own being, and it resonated with a deep, hollowed-out feeling in his own chest. He had lost his wife, Sarah, and their young son, Thomas, to a fever 2 winters ago. The sickness had swept through their valley, swift and merciless, and it had gutted his world, leaving him in a silent, empty house. Since then, his ranch had been a place of relentless order and hard work, a way to numb the mind and tire the body. But his house was a place of suffocating silence and memory. Every empty chair, every quiet corner, screamed with the absence of his family. He looked past the wretched girl on his porch for a moment, out at the vast, darkening plains that stretched to the edge of the world, and he saw a perfect reflection of his own loneliness. He needed someone, not for comfort, not for company, but to bring a semblance of life back into the silent rooms. He needed someone to cook and clean. His current cook was a grizzled old ranch hand named Gus, a man whose talents lay with ropes and branding irons, not skillets. Everything he touched was either burned or raw. Silas made a decision, a choice born not of pity. Pity was an emotion he could no longer afford. but out of a weary, pragmatic sense of his own need. His voice, when he finally spoke, was gruff, a low baritone that sounded unused to conversation, like an old engine that took a moment to turn over. "Can you cook?" The question was so unexpected that Alara started. She nodded frantically, a series of quick, bird-like jerks of her head, her eyes still fixed on his boots. "Can you clean?" Another frantic nod. He took a step closer, and she had to fight the urge to bolt. "I do not tolerate thieves, liars, or trouble," he said the last word with a heavy emphasis, his gray eyes boring into the top of her bowed head. "You bring trouble here. You will be gone before the sun sets." This was her chance to confess the truth, to tell him about the monster she kept locked inside her, the past that would surely be considered trouble. But she could not. The words would not form. To speak them would be to make them real again, to give them power here, in this place that held a sliver of impossible hope. She just shook her head, the movement small and jerky. It was at this moment, sensing a fragile, conditional acceptance, a reprieve from the wilderness, that the crushing weight of her own self-loathing surfaced, a bitter tide rising in her throat. She could not accept this small mercy without first declaring her own unworthiness of it. She finally forced herself to look up, to meet his gaze. Her pale blue eyes were swimming with a despair so profound, so absolute. It startled him. It was the look of a soul that had been completely and utterly broken. Her voice cracked, thick with a certainty that had been beaten into her over years of cruelty. "I know I ain't worth a job, sir," she whispered, the words tearing from her raw throat. I ain't much. You'll find reason to be rid of me soon enough. They all do. You'll fire me too." The statement was not a plea for reassurance. It was not a tactic to gain his sympathy. It was a declaration of what she believed to be an indisputable fact, a law of nature as certain as the rising of the sun. The raw, unvarnished brokenness in her voice, in her eyes, hit Silas with an unexpected and unwelcome force. It was a pain he recognized, a kind of soul-deep ache, even if the cause was different from his own. He saw clearly that she was not looking for a handout or an easy ride. She was a person who had been so thoroughly convinced of her own lack of value that she expected nothing but further pain, further rejection. And for the first time in 2 long, gray years, a feeling other than grief or numb duty stirred in his chest. It was a flicker of something sharp and unfamiliar, something fiercely protective. It was a surprising and deeply unwelcome impulse, and he immediately tried to smother it. He did not soften his tone, he did not offer a kind word, but his words were not what she expected. "I will be the judge of that," he said curtly. His eyes held hers for another second before he gave a curt nod. "There is a room off the kitchen. It is small. You can start tomorrow. We eat at sunup." He stepped back, pulling the heavy door wider. He held it open. For Alara, this small gesture, being invited in, was so shocking, so contrary to the entire narrative of her life, that she froze. Her feet felt nailed to the porch boards. She stared at the open doorway, at the rectangle of warm light spilling into the cool darkness, and she could not process it. People did not hold doors open for her. They slammed them shut. Seeing her hesitation, Silas's voice came again, impatient now. "Well, are you coming in, or are you planning to sleep out there?" The gruffness of his tone broke her paralysis. She scurried past him, careful not to brush against him, her head bowed again as if she were an unworthy servant entering a palace. He led her through the main room of the ranch house. It was Spartan and deeply masculine. The furniture was heavy, dark wood, built for function, not comfort. The air was thick with the scent of old wood smoke, leather, and something else, unspoken loss. The room was impeccably clean, yet it felt lifeless, as if no one ever truly lived in it. A thick layer of undisturbed dust covered the mantelpiece over a large, cold stone hearth. In the center of the mantel sat a single framed photograph, its image fading. Alara glimpsed it for only a second, a smiling woman with kind eyes and a small boy with a serious face sitting on her lap. She quickly looked away, a hot flush of shame rising in her cheeks. She was an intruder here, a piece of filth, sullying sacred ground. He did not stop. He led her through to the back of the house, to the kitchen, and then pointed to a narrow door. He pushed it open, revealing a small, simple room. It was little more than a closet, containing a narrow cot with a thin blanket, a small washstand with a pitcher and bowl, and a single, small window that looked out onto the dark, endless prairie. To Alara, who had been sleeping in ditches and abandoned sheds, who had forgotten what it felt like to have a roof over her head that was not shared with 10 other people, it was a palace. Silas stepped inside and placed the lantern he had picked up on a small wooden crate that served as a nightstand. The little room filled with a soft, steady glow. "There is stew on the stove," he said, his voice still rough, as if kindness were a foreign language he was forced to speak. "Eat. Do not let me see you starving yourself. You are no good to me, worked to the bone." He turned to leave, pausing in the doorway. He did not look at her, but spoke to the doorframe, his profile a hard silhouette against the kitchen light. "The door has a lock. Use it." Then he was gone, his heavy footsteps retreating, leaving her alone in the sudden, overwhelming silence. The finality of his words, especially the mention of the lock, was the first true act of kindness she had received in years. It was more than an offer of food or shelter. It was an acknowledgement of her fear, a granting of a safety and privacy she thought she would never know again. It was a gift of unimaginable value. Alone in her new room, she was overcome. She reached out a trembling hand and pushed the door shut. Her fingers found the simple iron bolt. She slid it home. The solid, definitive thunk of the lock settling into place was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. For a moment, she just stood there, leaning her forehead against the cool wood of the door, her whole body shaking with a mixture of profound relief and utter disbelief. The safety of the small room was so absolute, so foreign, that it felt like a dream she might wake from at any moment. After a time, her gnawing hunger drove her from the room. She crept into the dark kitchen and found the pot of stew on the back of the still-warm cook stove. Lifting the lid, she was met with a rich, savory steam that made her head swim. It was thick with beef and potatoes and carrots. Real food. Her hands shook so much as she ladled a small amount into a bowl that she spilled some on the floor. She knelt and wiped it up immediately with the hem of her dress before sitting at the small kitchen table. She ate slowly at first, forcing herself, her shrunken stomach protesting. Then a ravenous, desperate hunger took over. She devoured the stew, not even tasting it. Her focus narrowed to the simple, mechanical act of bringing the spoon to her mouth. Tears began to stream down her face. Silent, hot drops that mixed with the gravy in her bowl. It was not just food, it was a communion, a sacrament of survival. Each warm, life-giving spoonful was a protest against the world that had told her she deserved to starve. After she had scraped the bowl clean, she washed it carefully in the basin, her movements precise and quiet, already trying to make herself useful, to be invisible. She went back to her room and bolted the door again. She poured some of the cool, clean water from the pitcher into the bowl on the washstand and washed her face and hands. She looked at her reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror hanging from a nail on the wall. A stranger stared back at her, a feral, haunted-looking creature with wild eyes and hollow cheeks. She did not recognize the person she had become, but for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, as she stared into the depths of her own eyes, she saw a flicker of something else there, a tiny, fragile ember of hope that this place and the hard, sad man who owned it might truly be different. She was too exhausted to undress. She lay down on the cot, fully clothed, and pulled the thin, rough blanket up to her chin. For the first time in months, she slept behind a locked door, and for the first time in years, her sleep was empty and dreamless. Alara rose in the deep, star-dusted dark before the sun. She did not need a clock. The habit was etched into her bones, a legacy from a life where sleep was a luxury and the morning was a threat. The house was a vessel of profound silence. The only sound the constant dry whisper of the wind against the stout wooden walls. She moved with a practiced stealth that was second nature, her bare feet making no sound on the cool floorboards. Every motion was deliberate, calculated to be unheard. She was terrified of making a noise that might disturb the master of the house, terrified of giving him a reason, any reason, to regret his strange, conditional act of mercy. A cracked floorboard, a dropped pan. Any small mistake could be the one that sent her back into the wilderness. The kitchen, even in the cold pre-dawn, was her sanctuary. It was a space with a purpose she understood. Here, she could work, and work was a shield. She found the bin of flour, a tin of salt, a crock of white lard. Her hands, clumsy from cold and long disuse in this sort of work, felt stiff and foreign, but the memory was there, buried deep. Slowly, the motions of making biscuits came back to them, the sifting of the flour, the cutting in of the lard until the mixture felt like coarse meal, the careful addition of water. It was a rhythm, a meditation. She knelt and built a fire in the belly of the big iron cook stove, her movements quick and efficient. The kindling caught, and the flames began to lick at the larger pieces of wood, their hungry crackle a welcome sound in the stillness. A steady warmth began to push back the pre-dawn chill, and with it, the deeper, more permanent chill that seemed to live inside her as she worked, rolling out the dough on the floured countertop. Her mind was a torrent of anxieties. The biscuits would be too hard, or too flat. The coffee, when she made it, would be too weak, or too bitter. Each potential failure was a catastrophe in the making. She replayed their brief conversation from the night before, turning Silas's words over and over, examining them from every angle like a prospector searching for a flaw in a stone. I do not tolerate thieves, liars, or trouble. The word trouble echoed in her mind. She was trouble. She had been told so her entire life. Sooner or later, he would see it too. She analyzed the cadence of his gruff voice, the hard set of his jaw, searching for the hidden clause, the unspoken exception that would lead to her inevitable dismissal. The rising sun began to spill pale, watery light across the kitchen floor. The light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, turning them into a swirling galaxy of tiny, golden specks. Through the window over the basin, she could see the landscape outside being painted in the soft pastels of dawn. The harsh, sun-beaten plains were transformed by the gentle light into a place of quiet, aching beauty. The distant hills were layered in shades of lavender and rose, and the sagebrush was tipped with silver. It was a lonely, beautiful sight, and she realized with a start that she had never had the safety or the peace of mind to truly appreciate a sunrise before. Mornings had always been about survival, about bracing for the day's hardships. This quiet moment of beauty felt like a stolen treasure, and the feeling of peace that settled over her as she worked was so foreign it was almost painful. The smell of baking biscuits and rich, brewing coffee began to fill the small house. It was a warm, domestic aroma, the smell of a home. It felt like a trespass, a fragrant violation of the palpable grief that seemed to be the true owner of this place. Silas entered the kitchen just as the fiery orange rim of the sun crested the horizon. He moved as quietly as she did, and he was standing in the doorway before she was aware of him. He stopped there, the scene before him catching him completely off guard. It was the smells that hit him first. Coffee, bacon, warm bread. They were ghosts, scents from another life, a life that had been stolen from him by a fever 2 winters ago. For a disorienting moment, the quiet competence of Alara's movements as she set plates on the small kitchen table blurred. He did not see a timid, frightened stranger. He saw his Sarah, her back to him, humming a soft, tuneless song as she always did in the morning. The illusion was so powerful, so achingly real, that a deep pang of loss, sharp and physical, lanced through his chest. He blinked, and the image shattered. The ghost was gone, replaced by this thin girl in a ragged dress who moved like a startled deer. He felt the familiar wall of stoicism slide back into place, a necessary armor against the ambush of memory. "Smells decent," he grunted. His voice came out rougher, harsher than he intended. Ilara jumped as if struck, a small, sharp cry escaping her lips. The fork in her hand slipped from her grasp and clattered loudly on the wooden floor. The sound seemed to cannon through the quiet room. She immediately stooped to pick it up, her movements frantic and apologetic. "Sorry, sir. I am so sorry. I did not hear you come in. I am sorry." Her panic was so out of proportion to the minor incident that it struck Silas with a flash of irritation. It was not an irritation at her, but at the unseen. Unknown forces of the world that had taken a young woman and honed her nerves to such a fine, screaming point. The world that had made her this way. He pointedly ignored her distress, not knowing how to address it and unwilling to try. He sat down at the head of the small kitchen table. "Just coffee," he said, his voice flat. Her hand trembled slightly as she poured the steaming black liquid into his cup. She served him a plate piled high with crisp bacon and 4 fluffy, golden brown biscuits. Then, she retreated to the far side of the kitchen, standing by the stove with her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if awaiting a verdict. She did not dare to make a plate for herself. She would not eat until he had his fill, not until she knew if her work was acceptable. She watched him covertly as he cut into a biscuit with his fork, slathered it with butter, and took a bite. He chewed, his expression unreadable. He took another bite, then a sip of coffee. He did not say a word, but he ate all 4 biscuits. For Ilara, that was praise enough. The days that followed fell into a quiet, fragile routine. Ilara was an indefatigable worker, driven by a desperate need to prove her worth. She cleaned the house with a thoroughness that bordered on obsession. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She washed the windows until the harsh landscape outside seemed startlingly clear and close. She was scrubbing away not just the accumulated dust of a widower's home, but the thick, stagnant layer of grief that seemed to cling to every surface. She found Silas's mending basket, overflowing with work clothes torn by wire and brush. She spent her afternoons by the window, her needle flashing, her stitches small, neat and nearly invisible. She cooked simple, hearty meals, the kind of food a man who worked hard from sunup to sundown needed. She did it all in a state of near-perfect silence. She moved through the house like a ghost, a whisper of movement in the quiet rooms. She learned the rhythms of Silas's life and made it her mission to remain invisible within them. She avoided him whenever possible, communicating through actions rather than words. A hot meal on the table, a clean shirt laid out, a full wood box by the stove. If he entered a room, she would find a reason to leave it, murmuring a quiet, "Excuse me, sir," as she slipped past. She ate her own small meals standing by the kitchen counter, and only after he had finished and left the room, she was trying to make herself so useful, so essential, and yet so invisible, that he would simply forget to fire her. Silas, in turn, observed her from a distance, from the corner of his eye. He watched her move through his home, bringing a quiet order back to the chaos of his life. He noticed the way she still flinched if he moved too quickly or spoke without warning. He noticed how she never, ever looked him directly in the eye, her gaze always fixed on the floor, the table, his boots. He noticed the way she seemed to hold her breath whenever he was near, as if waiting for a blow. He was a man who knew how to read livestock, how to see the signs of fear or past abuse in a horse. He saw the same signs in her. He saw the deep, purple bruises on her soul. But he also noticed other things, small things that she probably thought went unseen. He noticed the clutch of purple and yellow wildflowers she had picked and put in a small glass jar on the kitchen windowsill, a tiny splash of color in the monochrome world. He saw the gentle, almost tender way she spoke to the ranch's shy barn cat when it ventured into the kitchen, her voice a low, sweet murmur. He sometimes heard a quiet, tuneless hum escape her lips when she was kneading bread dough, her brow furrowed in concentration, lost in the rhythm of the work and thinking she was completely alone. These small, fleeting glimpses of the person buried beneath the layers of trauma were like shafts of light piercing the gloom of a dark, shuttered room. They were glimmers of the woman she might have been, and perhaps could still be. The first real test of their fragile arrangement came a week after her arrival, with the midday meal. The bell he had rung brought the other ranch hands in from the corral. There were 3 of them: a cynical, leather-faced old-timer named Gus, a quiet, serious young man named Ben, who rarely spoke, and a coarse, swaggering hand named Cole, a man who carried himself with an arrogant air. When they filed into the kitchen, their loud voices, their dusty clothes, and their boisterous energy were a violent intrusion into the quiet atmosphere of the house. The air, which had been still and peaceful moments before, was suddenly filled with their noise. Elara, who was at the stove, froze. Her back went rigid, and she pressed herself against the wall as if trying to merge with it. Her face, when she turned, was pale, her eyes wide with a familiar, hunted look. Cole's eyes, bold and insolent, roamed over her, taking in her thin frame and the fear in her posture. A predatory glint lit them, and a slow, unpleasant smirk spread across his face. He looked from her to Silas. "Well now, boss," he drawled, his voice thick with insinuation. "See you finally found some pretty decoration for the house." The air in the kitchen crackled with a sudden, sharp tension. The crude remark hung in the silence, ugly and obvious. Elara shrank further into herself, her eyes wide with a terror that was stark and absolute. She looked like a rabbit cornered by a coyote. Before Silas could even react, the old hand, Gus, shot Cole a withering glare, his weathered face tight with disgust. "Shut your mouth! Cole!" he snapped. "Cannot you see you are scaring her half to death?" But the damage was done. Elara served the meal with trembling hands, her gaze fixed firmly on the floor. She moved around the table like an automaton, refilling coffee cups and placing a platter of sliced beef in the center, all while studiously avoiding Cole's leering, persistent stare. Silas watched the entire exchange from the head of the table. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He did not say a word, did not raise his voice. He simply ate his meal in a silence that was more menacing than any shout could ever be. His jaw was a tight, hard line, and his gray eyes, when they rested on Cole for a brief moment, were like chips of ice. The other hands felt it. The boisterous energy evaporated, replaced by a tense, uncomfortable quiet. They ate quickly and left, the screen door slamming shut behind them. After they were gone, the silence they left behind was heavy and suffocating. Elara began to clear the plates from the table, her movements stiff and jerky. Her hands shook, and she nearly dropped a plate. She expected Silas to say something, to reprimand her, to tell her she was the cause of this tension, this trouble. This was it, she thought. This is the reason. This is when he tells me to go. That evening, as dusk was settling, Silas found Cole by the stables. He was sitting on an overturned bucket, sharpening a skinning knife on a whetstone, the rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone a harsh sound in the quiet air. Silas's approach was silent, his boots making no sound in the thick dust. His presence, however, was a heavy weight. Cole looked up, a flicker of unease in his eyes. Silas did not raise his voice. He spoke in a low, level tone that was far more frightening than any yell. "She is my housekeeper," he said, his gray eyes fixed on Cole's face. "You will treat her with respect. You will not speak to her unless it concerns your meals. You will not look at her the way you did today." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If I see it happen again, or hear of it happening again, You will be collecting your pay and riding out before sunset. Am I understood?" Cole, who was used to bluster and shouted threats, was visibly shaken by Silas's cold, deadly calm. The bravado drained from his face. He swallowed, his eyes dropping to the knife in his hands. He muttered a single, affirmative word. The message was clear and absolute. There would be no second warning. Later that night, Ilara was in the kitchen, washing the last of the supper dishes. She was just finishing when Silas entered the room. She immediately tensed, her back going rigid, expecting the worst. He did not look at her. He walked over to the counter, his steps heavy on the floorboards, and placed a small, neatly wrapped package on the worn wood. "For you," he said, his voice still gruff, as if the words were pulled from him against his will. "Figured your shoes have seen better days." He turned and left the kitchen before she could find her voice to respond. She stared at the brown paper package, her heart hammering in her chest. Her hands were wet, and she dried them carefully on her apron before reaching for it. Her fingers trembled as she untied the string. Inside the paper was a pair of sturdy leather work boots. They were not fancy, not a lady's shoe, but they were new and well made, with thick soles and strong laces, practical, solid. Ilara stared at them, her mind reeling. No one had ever given her a gift before, not a real one, not one that was not a prelude to some terrible demand, and certainly not one so practical, so deeply thoughtful. The rags on her feet were falling apart. She had been planning to try and tie them together with twine. This was a gesture that spoke volumes, that said things his gruff voice never could. It said, "I expect you to stay. I want you to be comfortable here. I want your feet to be protected on this hard land." The boots were a promise. They were an anchor. She lifted one out of the paper. She could smell the rich, clean scent of the new leather. She held it in her hands, tracing the strong, even stitching with her fingertips. And for the second time since arriving at this ranch, she cried. But these were not the tears of sorrow or hunger she had cried before. These were tears of a confusing, painful, and overwhelming gratitude. A slow, subtle shift began in their dynamic after that. The wall of silence between them did not crumble, but a few small, hairline cracks appeared. Ilara started to wear the boots, and the solid feel of them on her feet gave her a strange, new confidence. She started to look at him, just for a second or two at a time, before her courage failed and her gaze dropped back to the floor. One afternoon, he came in from the range, his face pale and grim. A deep, wicked-looking gash ran down his forearm. A run-in with a new stretch of barbed wire. Blood was welling from the cut, dripping onto the floor. He went to the basin, trying to clean it himself, but his movements were clumsy and awkward with his uninjured hand. Ilara saw him struggling. She hesitated for a long moment, her fear of overstepping her bounds warring with a simple human impulse to help. The impulse won. She approached him hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her. I can help, sir, if you will let me." He looked up, surprised by her initiative. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his gray eyes before he gave a short, curt nod and held out his arm. Her touch was feather-light as she took his large, calloused hand to steady his arm. She cleaned the wound with a clean cloth and cool water, her movements gentle and sure. Her proximity was unsettling for both of them. He was acutely aware of her standing so close, of the warmth radiating from her small hands. He could smell the faint, clean scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. She was focused completely on her task, her brow furrowed in concentration, her lips pressed together. For those few minutes, as she carefully tended to his injury, their established roles dissolved. She was not a frightened victim, and he was not a grieving recluse. They were just two people, one tending to the other in a quiet kitchen. When she finished wrapping the wound with a clean strip of linen, she pulled back quickly, her face flushed, as if suddenly aware of the intimacy of the moment. "There," she murmured, her eyes on the new white bandage. The moment of connection, of shared vulnerability, hung in the air between them, unspoken and powerful. The landscape itself seemed to conspire to push them together. A sudden, violent thunderstorm rolled in one evening without warning. The sky, which had been a clear, pale blue, turned a bruised, angry purple-black. Lightning, stark and white, split the heavens, followed moments later by deafening cracks of thunder that shook the very foundations of the house. The wind, which was usually a whisper, rose to a mournful howl, like a bereaved animal, rattling the window panes in their frames. Ilara, who had spent so much of her life exposed to the elements, with only a thin canvas or a leaky shed for shelter, was terrified. Each clap of thunder was a physical blow, making her jump and her body go rigid with fear. She tried to hide it, busying herself in the kitchen with tasks that did not need doing, but Silas saw it. From his chair in the main room, he saw the way she wrapped her arms around herself, the stark terror in her eyes every time the sky lit up. He remembered how his wife, Sarah, had loved the storms. She would stand on the porch, her face turned up to the wind, and watch them roll in, thrilled by their power and fury. The memory brought the familiar ache, but it was softer this time. He did not offer Ilara empty platitudes. He did not tell her not to be afraid. He knew the words would be useless. Instead, he rose and lit a few extra lanterns in the main room, pushing back the encroaching shadows, making the space brighter and warmer. He sat back down in his chair by the cold, empty hearth and began to clean a rifle. The steady, methodical, metallic sounds of his movements a silent reassurance in the roaring chaos. He did not ask her to join him, but his presence filled the room, a solid, unmovable bulwark against the raging storm outside. After a while, Ilara crept out of the kitchen. She hesitated in the doorway before moving to a small, three-legged stool on the other side of the room, as far from him as she could be while still being in the same space. They did not speak. He continued to clean his rifle, and she sat with her hands clasped in her lap, watching the firelight from the lanterns dance on the walls. Together, they listened to the storm spend its fury. In that shared, silent vigil, a profound and unspoken bond was forged. They were two lonely people in a vast and violent land, two souls shipwrecked by life, finding a small, temporary island of safety in each other's quiet company. The storm eventually passed, moving eastward across the plains. It left behind a world that felt washed clean, the air sharp and smelling of rain-soaked earth and sage. The silence that descended in the wake of the thunder was different from the silence that had come before. It was not empty. It was not heavy with grief or fear. It was peaceful. A tentative peace had settled over the ranch, as fragile and as beautiful as a spider's web in the morning dew. In the weeks since the storm, a quiet rhythm had established itself, a life measured not in fear, but in the steady turning of the days. The constant, grinding anxiety in Ilara's gut had softened into a dull, watchful caution. She was beginning to feel the solid earth beneath the soles of her new boots, to believe, in fleeting moments, that this sanctuary might just be real. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low in the west, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the plains. Ilara was outside, hanging laundry on a line strung between the house and a tall wooden post. The simple, domestic act was a source of deep, quiet satisfaction. The scent of the lye soap, the clean dampness of the sheets in her hands, the rhythmic motion of pinning them to the line. It was all part of a life she had never imagined for herself. A light breeze rustled the cotton, making the sheets billow and snap like the sails of a ship navigating a calm, golden sea. She was humming, the same tuneless little melody that sometimes escaped her when she felt unobserved and at ease. She felt the vibration before she heard the sound. It was a faint tremor in the ground, a low thrum that traveled through the soles of her boots and up into her bones. It was the feeling of hoofbeats. She paused, a wooden clothespin in her hand, and listened. The sound came a moment later, the steady, rhythmic drumming of a single horse, moving at a confident pace. She looked up, shading her eyes against the glare of the setting sun, and scanned the horizon. She saw him then, a lone figure on horseback, still a dark silhouette against the vast, open range to the south. A prickle of unease ran down her spine. He was not on the main trail that led from town. He was cutting across the open plains, as if he knew a shortcut, or as if he were a hunter who had no need for established paths. The cold, familiar dread that had been her lifelong companion began to coil slowly in the pit of her stomach. She told herself it was just a traveler, a drifter looking for a night's work, but the feeling would not subside. As the rider drew closer, his form began to take on shape and detail. The horse was a powerful black gelding. The man sat tall in the saddle, with an unnatural stillness that was not restful, but predatory. The setting sun caught the silver conchos on his saddle and the buckle of his gun belt. He was perhaps a quarter of a mile away when his features began to resolve out of the shimmering heat haze. And in that instant, Alara's world stopped. Her humming died in her throat. Her blood, which had been warm and alive, turned to ice water in her veins. It was Jebediah. He was a predator in human form, a man carved from cruelty. He was handsome in a way that was sharp and dangerous, with a strong jaw and black hair that curled over the collar of his shirt. But his eyes were black and empty, like holes burned in a blanket, and his smile, which he used often, was a cold, practiced thing that never, ever reached them. He had been her protector in the grimy, desperate mining town she had finally fled. He was the man who had owned her, body and soul, and who had taken a deep, ugly pleasure in reminding her of that ownership with his fists, his contempt, and the casual way he spoke of her as if she were a piece of furniture. The sight of him paralyzed her. The wicker laundry basket slipped from her numb fingers. The clean, damp sheets she had just washed tumbled into the thick dust of the yard. Her breath caught in her throat, a strangled, silent scream that had nowhere to go. Every bit of progress she had made, every fragile wall she had built around her heart, every tiny, hopeful shoot of a new life, evaporated in that single, horrifying instant. The peace of the ranch was not just shattered, it was annihilated. She was no longer Alara, the quiet, competent housekeeper of the Rocking S Ranch. She was Ellie Girl again, the broken, terrified creature who had stumbled to Silas's door weeks ago. Only now, the terror was 1,000 times worse, because this time, she had something to lose. She had everything to lose. Jebediah swung down from his horse with a lazy, arrogant grace, his spurs jingling softly in the sudden, heavy silence. He let the reins drop to the ground, knowing his well-trained horse would not move. He ignored Alara's frozen, terrified state, his cold eyes scanning the ranch house, the barn, the corrals, with a proprietary air, as if he were assessing an investment. "Well, now," he said, and his voice scraped across Alara's raw nerves. It was a low, menacing drawl, a sound she had prayed to God she would never hear again. "Look at what the cat dragged in. Found yourself a nice little hidey-hole. Did you, Ellie Girl?" He used the name he had given her, the diminutive, possessive name that felt like a hot brand on her skin. He took a slow, deliberate step toward her. The movement broke her paralysis, and she flinched back so violently that her heel caught on a rock and she stumbled, falling backward into the dust beside the fallen laundry. He stopped and chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "Still skittish as a freshly weaned colt. Some things never change." His smile widened, a slash of white in his sun-darkened face. He saw her fear, and he fed on it. It was what he had come for. It was his nourishment. "I have been looking for you," he continued, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that was more terrifying than a shout. "A valuable piece of property like you does not just get to walk away. It is bad for business. Gives the other girls ideas. He spoke of her as if she were an object, a runaway mule he had patiently tracked down. Every word was a carefully chosen tool, designed to strip away the fragile layers of humanity she had begun to reclaim, to remind her of her place, of what she was. He took another step, so he was standing almost over her. She scrambled backward in the dust, trying to put distance between them. "Get your things," he said, his voice flat and final. "Whatever little rags you have got. We are leaving." Ilara could not move. She could not speak. Her mind was a whiteout of pure, animalistic terror. The world had narrowed to this man, to the threat he embodied. Her past was no longer a collection of haunting memories. It was standing right in front of her, real and solid and inescapable. She was trapped. Silas came out of the barn, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He had heard the arrival of the unfamiliar horse and had come to see who it was. He took in the scene in a single, swift, comprehensive glance. Ilara crumpled on the ground like a broken doll, her face a mask of stark, white terror. The stranger's horse, standing with the reins dropped, a sign of an arrogant and confident owner, and the stranger himself, standing over Ilara with an air of smug, absolute ownership. He did not know who this man was, but he recognized the look in his eyes instantly. It was the look of a wolf cornering a rabbit, of a predator enjoying the fear of its prey. And in that moment, something ignited inside Silas. A cold, protective rage, purer and hotter than anything he had felt since the fever had taken his family, surged through him. It was a clean, righteous fury that burned away the last vestiges of his grief-numbed apathy. He started walking forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He did not run, he did not shout, he simply moved across the yard, a solid, inexorable force, and he positioned himself between Jebediah and the terrified woman on the ground. He did not look at Ilara. His entire focus, every ounce of his formidable presence, was locked on the threat. "This is private property," Silas said. His voice was deceptively calm, a low rumble that carried easily in the still air. "State your business and be on your way." Jebediah slowly turned his attention from Ilara to Silas, his eyes narrowing as he sized up this new obstacle. He saw a simple rancher, a man of the earth, broad-shouldered and weathered, but no one of consequence. He underestimated him completely. "My business," Jebediah sneered, gesturing dismissively with his chin toward Ilara, "is with my property. The girl works for me. She ran off some time ago. I am here to collect her." "She works for me now," Silas stated. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, but they landed like a thunderclap in the charged atmosphere. It was a simple declaration, but it was absolute. He was not arguing or negotiating. He was stating a fact. He was claiming her, not as property, as Jebediah had, but as a part of his household, a person under his protection. This was a line being drawn in the dust of the yard. Ilara, still on the ground, heard his words through the roaring in her ears. "She works for me now." The words pierced through the white fog of her terror, and a tiny, shocked flicker of defiance ignited within her. Someone was fighting for her. For the first time in her life, someone was standing up for her. Jebediah let out a harsh, ugly laugh. "Is that so? You paying her a wage? Because I can assure you, her last position paid room and board, and she was always very accommodating." The vile insinuation was clear, designed to shame her, to shame Silas for taking in what the world would call soiled goods. It was a test. He expected the simple, respectable rancher to be disgusted, to wash his hands of this tainted woman now that her past was laid bare. But Silas did not flinch. His hard, gray eyes narrowed, becoming chips of granite. "What she did before she came to this ranch is none of my concern," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low growl. "And it is sure as hell none of yours anymore. Get on your horse. Leave." Jebediah, a man unused to being defied, especially by a man he considered his inferior, lost his smirk. His handsome face hardened into an ugly mask of anger. His right hand, which had been resting on his thigh, drifted slowly, casually, toward the butt of the pistol holstered at his hip. "I do not think you understand," he said softly, his voice a venomous hiss. "She belongs to me." At that moment, Silas moved. He moved with a speed that was shocking, that completely belied his size and his previously deliberate gait. He closed the 10 feet between them in 2 long, ground-eating strides, before Jebediah could even clear the leather of his holster. Silas's hand clamped down on his wrist. The grip was like a vise of iron forged in a smith's fire. Jebediah's eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and sharp, excruciating pain. He grunted, his fingers spasming, losing their grip on the gun. "She belongs to no one," Silas snarled, his face inches from Jebediah's, his voice a low, guttural roar of pure, condensed fury. "And you will take your hand off that gun, or I swear to God I will break your arm right here in my yard." The raw, physical power radiating from Silas was an undeniable, elemental force. Jebediah, for all his swagger and cruelty, was a bully. And like all bullies, he preyed on the weak, on those who could not or would not fight back. Faced with a man who was not only stronger, but possessed a will far more resolute than his own, his courage crumbled into dust. He wrenched his hand away from the gun, a strangled cry of pain escaping his lips as Silas's grip tightened for a fraction of a second before releasing him. He stumbled back, cradling his wrist, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and profound humiliation. "This is not over, rancher," he spat, venom dripping from every word. "You will regret this." He scrambled back to his horse, his arrogant grace completely gone, replaced by a clumsy haste. He swung himself into the saddle and shot one last look of pure, concentrated venom at Alara, a look that promised retribution. Then he yanked the horse's head around and spurred it viciously, galloping away, disappearing back into the vast plains he had come from. The moment the sound of his hoofbeats faded into the distance, the adrenaline that had been holding Alara together, the fragile spark of defiance that Silas's words had ignited, dissolved completely. A great shuddering tremor ran through her entire body, a violent, uncontrollable quake. She curled into a tight, fetal ball on the ground, her arms wrapped around her head as if to shield herself from a physical blow, and she began to sob. They were not the quiet, grateful tears she had shed before. These were wrenching, guttural sounds that were torn from the deepest part of her soul, the sounds of an animal in a trap. It was the sound of pure, undiluted terror and abject despair. The past she had run so hard and so far to escape had found her. It had tracked her down and contaminated the one safe place she had ever known in her entire life. She had brought trouble to Silas's door, just as she always knew she would. Silas turned from watching the rider disappear, his own cold anger receding like a tide, leaving behind a deep, aching concern. He looked down at the sobbing, trembling woman at his feet, and his heart, which he had thought was long dead and buried, cracked. He walked over and knelt beside her, his movements slow and careful, as if he were approaching a wounded, terrified animal that might bolt at the slightest sudden move. He did not know what to do. He did not know what to say. The soft platitudes of comfort were foreign to him, words from a language he no longer spoke. So he did the only thing he could. He simply stayed there, his large frame a silent, protective presence, shielding her from the vast, empty landscape that seemed to stretch on forever. He waited for the first violent storm of her tears to pass, his patience as immense and as steady as the land itself. When her sobs finally subsided into ragged, gasping breaths, he spoke. His voice was softer, gentler than she had ever heard it. It was a voice she did not know he possessed. "He is gone. Alara, he is not going to hurt you. I will not let him." He used her name. Not girl, not you. Alara, the sound of it from his lips, spoken with such quiet, gentle gravity, was both a profound shock and a deep, unexpected comfort. It was an affirmation that she was a person, not a piece of property. He reached down and gently, carefully, helped her to her feet. She was unsteady, her body still trembling uncontrollably. She could not seem to stop shaking, as if the terror had lodged itself deep in her muscles. He put a steadying arm around her shoulders and guided her back into the house, away from the open, vulnerable space of the yard, and into the warmth and safety of the kitchen. Her mind was a chaotic, horrifying storm, replaying every cruel word, every casual act of brutality from her life with Jebediah. The trauma was not a memory anymore. It was a living thing inside her, with claws and teeth, and it was tearing her apart from the inside. She collapsed onto a chair at the kitchen table, buried her head in her hands, and continued to shake. This was a full-blown panic attack, a helpless, terrifying descent into the private hell of her past. Silas looked at her, and he saw that she was not just scared. She was drowning in a sea of memory and fear. He acted on pure, unthinking instinct. He went into the main room and returned with a heavy wool blanket from the back of his own chair. He draped it around her shoulders, the weight of it intended to be grounding, an anchor in the storm. He then moved to the stove and put a kettle on to boil. The simple, methodical action, a small bastion of normalcy in the chaos of her emotions. He did not push her to talk. He did not ask questions. He pulled up another chair and just sat at the table with her as the dusk gathered outside. His presence a quiet, unwavering vigil. He was guarding her now, not just from the man who had ridden away, but from the ghosts that man had unleashed inside her. This shared trauma, his silent, steadfast witnessing of her deepest fear made manifest, fundamentally and irrevocably changed their relationship. In that moment, he was no longer just her employer. He was her protector. And for Alara, huddled under the heavy blanket, he was something more, something she had never had in her entire life. He was the first person who had not turned away from her brokenness, who had not recoiled from her past, but had instead, without hesitation, stood between her and the monster. And in the wreckage of her terror, a new, powerful, and utterly terrifying emotion began to take root in the ravaged soil of her heart. A deep and complicated love for the silent, grieving man who had just declared to the world, and to her, that she was his to protect. The aftermath of Jebediah's visit descended upon the house like a plague of silence. It was an oppressive, suffocating quiet, thick with unspoken fear and impotent rage. The tentative peace they had built was not just broken, it had been poisoned. Alara became a ghost of her former self, a pale, silent specter moving through the rooms. The tentative confidence she had gained, the small sparks of life that had begun to light her eyes, were all extinguished, leaving behind a familiar, haunted vacancy. She moved through her chores mechanically, her hands performing the tasks of cooking and cleaning while her mind was elsewhere, trapped in a loop of terror. Her eyes, once they had started to cautiously observe the world around her, were now constantly darting towards the windows, scanning the vast, empty horizon. She was watching for him. She was expecting to see his dark silhouette appear against the skyline, coming to reclaim his property, to punish her for her brief taste of freedom. Every gust of wind that rattled the window pane sounded like the drumming of hoofbeats. Every long, distorted shadow cast by the setting sun became the shape of a man on a horse. The world outside the safety of these walls was no longer indifferent. It was menacing, filled with threats only she could see. She barely ate, pushing the food around her plate until it grew cold. Silas would watch her, his own meal tasting like ash in his mouth. At night, a profound stillness would fall over the ranch, but he could hear her. Through the thick walls, he could hear the faint, restless sound of her pacing in her small room, a caged animal unable to find rest. The terror had sunk its teeth into her, and it was not letting go. Silas watched her slow, agonizing regression, and a knot of helpless frustration tightened in his chest. He was a man of action, a man who solved problems with his hands, with strength and resolve. He had driven away the physical threat, had met force with greater force. But he was utterly powerless against the phantoms that now haunted her mind. He could not wrestle her memories to the ground. He could not put a bullet in her fear. This powerlessness was a new and bitter thing, and it curdled into a grim, brooding quiet. He found himself growing furiously angry. A cold, simmering rage directed at the man. Jebediah. He was angry at him for doing this to her, for taking the fragile, tentative thing that had been beginning to heal and marring it so deeply. His protective instincts, now fully awakened, had nowhere to go. There was no one to fight, and so they turned inward, fueling a dark, silent anger that settled over him like a shroud. The space between them, which had once been filled with a budding, unspoken understanding, was now choked with the thick, toxic air of her fear and his rage. Several days passed in this state of high, silent tension. The house felt like a powder keg, waiting for a spark. The spark came on a Tuesday evening, in the form of a simple ceramic plate. The air was cool, and a lonely wind was keening around the corners of the house. Elara was at the wash basin, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. Her movements, usually so precise, were jerky and uncertain. Her hands would not stop trembling. She was washing the supper dishes when a heavy plate, slick with soap, slipped from her grasp. It seemed to hang in the air for a moment before it fell, hitting the stone floor with a loud, sharp crash that echoed the shattering of her own composure. The sound was a gunshot in the silent house. It was the final straw, the one small thing that her frayed nerves could not endure. A small, choked cry escaped her lips, a sound of utter defeat, and she simply folded. She sank to the floor amidst the jagged white pieces of the broken plate, her shoulders shaking with silent, desperate sobs that tore through her thin frame. She did not bother to move away from the sharp shards. She just knelt there, broken among the broken things. Silas was in the main room, sitting in his armchair by the cold hearth, trying to read a week-old newspaper. The words had been swimming meaninglessly before his eyes for the past hour, at the sound of the crash, followed by that small, wounded cry. He was on his feet in an instant. He was in the kitchen in 3 long strides. He saw her there, a small, huddled shape on the floor, weeping into her hands. And his heart, that tough, scarred organ, cracked clean in 2. He did not speak. He walked over and, with movements that were slow and deliberate, began to carefully pick up the larger shards of ceramic. He placed them one by one on the counter, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He did not scold her. He did not show the slightest hint of annoyance over the broken plate. He simply cleared a space around her, removing the immediate, physical danger of the sharp edges. When he had cleared a patch of the floor, he knelt in front of her, his knees cracking in the quiet room. "Elara," he said, his voice low and steady, a deep, resonant sound that cut through the sound of her weeping. It was just a plate. But they both knew it was not about the plate. It was about everything. He was giving her an opening, a safe space to let the poison out. He was kneeling in the wreckage with her, and he was not going to leave. And she did. The story of her past, the ugly, terrible truth she had kept locked away in the deepest, darkest cellar of her soul, spilled out of her. It did not come in a coherent narrative. It was a flood, a torrent of broken phrases, choked-off sobs, and violent shudders that racked her body. "They came at night," she whispered, her voice a raw, ragged thing. "My PA, my ma, the smoke, so much smoke." She told him about her family, about the small, happy homestead that had been burned to the ground in a raid when she was just a girl, and how she had been the only one taken alive. Her story jumped then, to the raw, muddy streets of a mining camp. "So cold," she shuddered, wrapping her arms around herself as if feeling a chill that had settled in her bones years ago. Always so cold, and the looks, the way they looked. She spoke of the brutality of that life, of being a piece of property to be used and discarded, of being passed from one rough, callless man to another until Jebediah, with his cold smile and harder fists, had claimed her for his own. She spoke of the constant, soul-crushing degradation, of being made to feel less than human, of the hunger that was a constant companion, a gnawing beast in her belly. Then, her voice dropped even lower, to a barely audible whisper, and she confessed the deepest, darkest source of her shame. It was the thing that truly made her feel ruined, beyond any hope of redemption. It was not just what had been done to her. It was the things she had been forced to do to survive. The small, necessary cruelties. The compromises of her own humanity that had left her feeling complicit in her own destruction. I did things, she sobbed, to get extra food, to not get hit. I learned how to smile when I wanted to scream. I learned how to be what they wanted. She told him all of this with her face buried in her hands, completely unable to look at him. She was convinced that each word she spoke was another reason for him to be disgusted, another nail in the coffin of the fragile respect he had shown her. She was showing him the ugliest, most broken parts of herself, the parts she kept hidden even from her own conscious thought. She was laying her defiled soul bare on his kitchen floor, fully expecting him to recoil in horror, to finally see the filth she was and cast her out. When she was finished, when there were no more words, only the raw, ragged sound of her breathing, a painful silence filled the room. She waited, her body tensed for the judgment, for the final, damning words that would send her back out into the nothingness. "Now you know," she whispered to the floorboards. "Now you see why I ain't worth nothing, why I am ruined." Silas listened. He listened to her entire confession without interruption, his face a mask of stone. He listened to the words she managed to say, and he heard the volumes of pain in the words she could not articulate. He heard the story of a girl who had endured the unendurable. When she finally fell silent, he did not recoil. He did not move away. He did not say a word of condemnation. Instead, he reached out. His large, work-roughened hand hesitated in the air for a fraction of a second before it came to rest, with an impossible gentleness, on the crown of her bowed head. His fingers sank into her tangled hair, his palm warm and solid against her skull. The touch was not one of desire, or even of pity. It was a touch of profound, elemental comfort. It was a gesture of blessing, of absolution. "None of that was your fault," he said, and his voice was thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before, a deep, resonant empathy. "What you did to survive, that is called strength, Ilara, not sin." The simple, unequivocal acceptance in his words was a shock to her system. He was not disgusted. He did not see her as ruined. He saw her as strong. The words were a balm on a wound she had not known could be soothed. Tears, of a different kind now, welled in her eyes. And then he did something that shattered the last of his own defenses. To prove to her that she was not alone in her brokenness, he shared his own. "I had a wife," he said, his voice low, his hand still resting on her head. Her name was Sarah, and a son, Thomas. He told her about them, his words simple and unadorned, which made them all the more powerful. He spoke of the fever, of how it had swept through the valley, a thief in the night. He spoke of the terrifying helplessness of watching his vibrant, laughing wife wither away in a matter of days. He spoke of holding his 4-year-old son's small hand as the life faded from him, of promising the boy that he would make him better, a promise he was powerless to keep. He confessed his own deep, abiding guilt, a guilt that had been his constant companion for 2 long years. "I am a strong man," he said, his voice cracking for the first time. "I can fight off rustlers and break wild horses. I can build a house with my own 2 hands, but I could not save them. I could not save the 2 people I loved most in the world." He spoke of the crushing silence of the house after they were gone, of the ghost limbs he sometimes felt, his arm reaching for a wife who was not there, his hand reaching for a son who would never grow up. in the dimly lit kitchen, surrounded by the shards of a broken plate. They were no longer an employer and his damaged housekeeper. They were two survivors, laying their scarred souls bare for one another, their separate griefs and traumas weaving together to form a single, sacred bond. The shared vulnerability changed everything. Ilara slowly, hesitantly, raised her head and looked up at him. Her tear-streaked face was full of a stunned disbelief and a dawning, fragile wonder. Through her own tears, she saw past his stoic, hard exterior to the deep, aching well of pain inside him, a pain that was a perfect mirror of her own. In that moment, she understood him completely. She understood his silence, his solitude, his profound, bone-deep sorrow. He was not just a hard man, he was a heartbroken one. She reached up, her own small, trembling hand coming to rest on top of his, where it still lay on her head. It was a gesture of shared comfort, a silent acknowledgement that they were the same. We are broken in the same places. In that moment, the great, lonely dam of their loneliness broke. Silas looked down at her, at the raw courage in her tear-filled eyes, and he gently pulled her to her feet. His hands came to rest on her upper arms, his grip firm but gentle, holding her steady. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not look away. She held his gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, but a profound, soul-deep empathy. And in her eyes, he saw not a victim, but a warrior. The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken emotions. There was gratitude, and a profound sense of relief. There was a sorrow so deep it had become a bond, a foundation on which something new could be built. And there was something else, something new and powerful and electric that arced between them. Desire. It was a desire born not of a sudden lust, but of a soul-deep recognition of another's spirit, a desire to draw closer to the one person in the world who truly understood. Slowly, tentatively, he leaned in and kissed her. The kiss was not hungry or demanding. It was unbelievably soft, hesitant, a question and an answer all in one. It tasted of the salt from her tears and of a deep, abiding sorrow. For Ilara, who had only ever known kisses to be acts of violation, of ownership, a prelude to something worse, this kiss was a revelation. It was an act of giving, not of taking. It was an act of reverence. It was the gentlest thing she had ever experienced in her entire life. She responded with an answering gentleness, a surrender not of her body, but of her fear. Her hands, which had been limp at her sides, moved up to his chest, her palms resting flat against the solid, steady beat of his heart. The kiss deepened slightly, no longer a question, but a promise of healing, a vow of mutual sanctuary. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, both of them breathing raggedly, their breath mingling in the cool air of the kitchen. The world outside, with its dangers and judgments and the lingering threat of Jebediah, had faded away to a dull, distant roar. In this kitchen, in this moment, they had created a new world, just for the two of them. That night, Ilara lay on her narrow cot, but for the first time since Jebediah's visit, she did not feel fear. The memory of him was still there, a dark stain on her past, but it had been muted, overshadowed by the searing, vivid memory of Silas's confession, his gentle touch, his impossible kiss. She touched her own lips, the feeling of his mouth on hers still a phantom sensation, a warm ember in the cold room. She understood now, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he would not fire her. He would not let her leave. He would not let her leave because, in some fundamental, unspoken way, he needed her as much as she needed him. She was no longer just a housekeeper, and he was no longer just her employer. They were two halves of a whole, broken in different places, but fitting together perfectly. In his own room, down the hall, Silas lay awake, staring up at the dark ceiling. The ghosts of Sarah and Thomas were still there in the room with him. They would always be there. But for the first time in 2 years, they were not alone. The memory of Alara, the raw courage of her confession, her impossible resilience, the soft, trembling feel of her in his arms, filled the empty spaces in the room, in his heart. He felt a confusing, tumultuous mix of guilt and hope. Guilt for feeling this powerful, living connection to someone other than his wife, and a powerful, undeniable hope for a future he had long ago given up on, a future he had never believed he would have again. He knew that loving her would be complicated. He knew it would be dangerous. Jebediah was still out there, a lingering threat that would have to be dealt with. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not let her go. He had found something to protect again. He had found something to live for beyond mere, grim survival. Love, once confessed in the silent language of shared trauma and a single, hesitant kiss, began to bloom in the quiet corners of the ranch. It was not a wild, passionate fire, but a slow, tentative thing, like a hardy prairie wildflower pushing its way up through cracked, dry earth. It was a love full of a deep and abiding caution, and a reverence for the fragile thing they were building together. A new routine began to form, one that was built for two. The most significant change was the simplest. Silas stopped taking his meals in the lonely, echoing dining room, a room that felt more like a mausoleum for his past life. Instead, he began to eat at the small, scrubbed clean table in the kitchen with Alara. The first time he did it, she was so startled she nearly dropped the platter of fried chicken, but he simply sat, his presence filling the small, warm space, and waited. And so, she sat with him. In the quiet intimacy of those shared meals, they began to talk. The silence between them, once a barrier, became a comfortable space punctuated by the slow sharing of their histories. They exchanged the small, mundane details of their pasts. And for two people who had been so utterly alone, these simple stories felt as momentous as the telling of epic poems. He told her about growing up on a farm in Ohio, a place of green fields and humid summers, so different from this vast, dry land. He spoke of his father, a stern but fair man who had taught him how to work, and of his mother, a woman who smelled of cinnamon and who hummed constantly while she baked. She, in turn, hesitantly offered up the few precious, untainted memories she possessed. She told him about her own mother, before the raid, a woman with gentle hands who loved wildflowers. She described how her mother would press the flowers, Indian paintbrush, blue bonnets, and prairie roses, between the pages of the family Bible, preserving their delicate beauty. They were filling in the empty spaces of each other, sketching in the details of the people they had been before the world broke them. He began to teach her things. One afternoon, he took her to the corral and taught her how to properly saddle a horse. His large, calloused hands guided hers over the heavy leather of the saddle, his voice a low, patient rumble as he explained the purpose of each strap and buckle. She was acutely aware of his closeness, of the warmth of his hands as they brushed against hers, a sensation that made her skin tingle and her heart beat a little faster. He was giving her a skill, a tool for survival in this land, and in doing so, he was giving her a piece of his world. She, in turn, searched for ways to give him something back. Through careful, indirect questions posed to the old ranch hand, Gus, she discovered that Silas's favorite meal, the one his mother used to make, was apple pie. She had never made one before. She spent an entire day in a flurry of flour and determination, working from a recipe in a worn cookbook she found on a high shelf. The first 2 attempts were failures, one with a burned crust, the other with a watery filling, but the third, which she pulled from the oven just as he came in from the range, was perfect. The crust was golden and flaky. The filling was thick with cinnamon-spiced apples, and the smell filled the entire house. She watched, her heart in her throat. As he took the first bite, a slow, small smile, The first genuine smile she had ever seen from him touched his lips. He did not say much, only a gruff, "It is good." But the look in his eyes was all the praise she needed. The act of baking the pie was a loving tribute, a way of bringing a piece of his lost past back to him, of filling his house with a new, happy memory. Their touches became more frequent and less hesitant. His hand would brush hers as he took a cup of coffee from her in the morning. Her fingers would linger for a fraction of a second on the solid muscle of his arm as she passed by him in the narrow hallway. These small, fleeting intimacies were freighted with meaning, each one a quiet affirmation of the bond between them, each one a step further away from their isolated, lonely pasts. Even the harsh landscape around them seemed to soften, transformed by the lens of their shared affection. They began to watch the sunrises together, standing on the front porch with steaming mugs of coffee in their hands. They watched as the sky ignited in brilliant, impossible colors, the light spilling over the plains and chasing away the long, dark shadows of the night. The ranch was no longer just a place of work and grief and survival. It was becoming a home. It was becoming a sanctuary they were building together, board by board, memory by memory. But this fragile new world, this small island of peace they had created, was not immune to the old one. Word travels in the West, carried like burrs on the blankets of itinerant cowboys and whispered over the counters of supply wagons. The story of what had happened at the Rocking S Ranch began to circulate, morphing and twisting with each retelling. It became a sordid, simple tale. The grieving widower Silas Kane had driven off a pimp named Jebediah and had kept the man's soiled dove for himself. The next time Silas rode into the nearby town of Clearwater for supplies, the change was palpable. He felt it the moment he tied his horse to the hitching post in front of the general store. It was in the curious, sideways stares from men who had once greeted him with a hearty clap on the back. It was in the sudden, stiff silence that fell over the saloon when he walked in. Men who had known him for years, who had respected his quiet strength and integrity, now offered only curt, cool nods before turning away. The judgment of the women was even more pronounced. It was a cold, hard wall of disapproval. They would gather their skirts and cross the street to avoid walking on the same boardwalk as him. Martha Hemmings, the self-righteous and formidable wife of the town's preacher, looked at him from across the dusty street with an expression of open condemnation, her face a mask of pinched, righteous disgust. The social prejudice was a real and powerful force in their small, narrow minds. He was a man who had lowered himself, a man who had willingly brought scandal and sin into his once respectable home. The town, which had offered him a quiet, respectful pity in his grief, now offered him only judgment in his newfound, fragile happiness. Silas endured their scorn with his characteristic stoicism, his weathered face an unreadable mask. He conducted his business, bought his flour and salt and coffee, and spoke in the same quiet, level tones he always had. But inside, a cold, hard anger burned. He was not angry for himself. He had long ago stopped caring about the opinions of others. He was furious that their small, fearful minds would dare to pass judgment on Alara. He was enraged that they would try to tarnish the one good, pure thing that had entered his life in years, that they would try to define her by a past she had not chosen and had so bravely survived. His defiance in the face of their silent condemnation only hardened his resolve. Let them whisper, let them judge. He would protect her from them, just as he had protected her from Jebediah. The social ostracism was painful, a constant, low-grade fever of resentment, but the physical threat was far more terrifying. Jebediah was not a man to accept defeat. He was not a man to tolerate humiliation. In the weeks since Silas had broken his wrist and his pride, he had been stewing, his rage and shame festering into a potent, murderous poison. His desire was no longer just to reclaim his property. His goal now was total destruction. He wanted to burn Silas's life to the ground as punishment for his defiance. He returned, but not alone. He brought with him 2 other men, hired guns he had found in a filthy saloon on the edge of the territory. They were men like him, ruthless and empty, with dead eyes and a thirst for violence. They struck on a moonless night, the sky a black, starless canvas that offered no light and no comfort. Their first act was one of pure, malicious cruelty. They rode to the far pasture, a place of rich grass where Silas kept his best cattle, and they cut the fences. With whoops and hollers, they sent the panicked herd scattering into the wild. Open range, a devastating financial blow that would take months, if not years, to recover from. Then they rode for the heart of the ranch. They did not attack the house directly. They went for the hay barn. They piled dry brush against the old, weathered wood and set it alight. The dry hay inside caught instantly. The flames leaped into the night sky, a roaring, hungry orange beacon of destruction that painted the clouds in a hellish glow. Silas and Alara were awakened by the sound. It was a terrifying cacophony, the frantic, panicked bellows of the horses in the corral, the terrified lowing of the milk cow, and a deep, angry roar that sounded like the world was tearing itself apart. Silas was out of bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers as he went to the window. He saw the hellish glow outside, and his blood ran cold. The barn was an inferno. "Stay here," he commanded Alara, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Lock the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone. Do you understand me? No matter what you hear." She could only nod, her eyes wide with terror, her face a pale oval in the flickering, demonic light that filled the room. He grabbed his heavy Winchester rifle from its rack by the door and his double-barreled shotgun. He checked the loads with a swift, practiced movement and headed out into the fiery night. The ensuing confrontation was brutal and chaotic. The ranch yard, which had been a place of quiet work and budding love, was transformed into a war zone, illuminated by the terrible, dancing light of the blazing barn. Gunshots exploded in the night, the sharp crack of pistols and the deeper boom of Silas's rifle echoing across the plains. Silas knew he was outnumbered. He used his intimate knowledge of the land, of every trough, every fence post, every shadow, as his ally. He moved through the darkness, a deadly wraith, using the structures for cover as he exchanged fire with the three men who were spread out across the yard. The heat from the burning barn was intense and thick. Acrid smoke filled the air, stinging his eyes and choking his lungs. He managed to wound one of them, a lucky shot that sent the man screaming to the ground, clutching his leg. But in the chaos of the fight, another of the gunmen got the drop on him. A pistol barked from the shadows near the chicken coop. A searing, white-hot pain exploded in Silas's left shoulder. The impact spun him around like a top and sent him crashing hard to the ground. His rifle skittered out of his reach, landing in the dust several feet away. Jebediah, who had been directing the attack from near the main corral, saw his chance. He advanced on the wounded, fallen man, a triumphant, sadistic grin spreading across his handsome face. He walked slowly, savoring the moment, his pistol held loosely at his side. "I told you you would regret this, rancher," he said, his voice laced with venomous satisfaction as he came to a stop a few feet from Silas. He raised his pistol, taking careful aim at the center of Silas's chest, preparing to deliver the killing shot. Inside the house, Alara was frantic. She had followed Silas's orders, had slid the heavy bolt on the door, and had huddled in the center of the room, listening to the terrifying sounds of the gunfight. She had lived through violence before, but she had always been the victim, the helpless object of someone else's rage. The thought of Silas, the one person who had ever shown her true kindness, the one person who had ever fought for her, dying out there in the dirt for her, was an agony beyond anything she could bear. That unbearable thought ignited a fire in her, a rage that burned hotter and brighter than her fear. In an instant, the girl who flinched at shadows was gone, burned away. She was replaced by a woman fighting for the only home, the only love she had ever known. She would not be a victim tonight. Her eyes darted around the room and fell on the mantelpiece. She remembered the heavy, old 10-gauge shotgun Silas kept loaded and resting on 2 hooks above the cold hearth. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was suddenly icily clear. She dragged a chair over, climbed onto it, and took the weapon down. It was brutally heavy, far heavier than she had expected, and its cold, oily steel felt alien in her hands. But her resolve was as firm and as solid as the gun's wooden stock. She did not hesitate. She ran to the door, her bare feet silent on the floorboards, and unbolted it. She slipped out into the chaos of the night, pressing her back against the rough wood of the house, using the shadows just as she had seen Silas do. The heat from the burning barn was a physical blow, and the smoke was a choking blanket. Her eyes, streaming from the smoke, searched the fire-lit yard. She saw him. She saw Jebediah, his back to her, standing over the wounded, struggling form of Silas, all her survival instincts, honed through years of abuse and constant, fearful observation, kicked in. She knew how predators moved. She knew how to be invisible. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that she might only get one shot. She raised the shotgun. The stock was awkward and long, and she struggled to brace it against her unaccustomed shoulder. It bruised her cheek as she pressed her face against the wood, squinting down the long, dark barrel. Her entire world narrowed to that one sight, the back of the man who had stolen her childhood, who had tried to destroy her soul, and who was now about to kill the only good thing in her life. She pulled the trigger. The shotgun's roar was a deafening, apocalyptic blast that seemed to rip the night in two. The recoil was a vicious, physical blow, slamming her back hard against the wall of the house and nearly tearing the weapon from her grasp. But her aim, born of desperation and pure, focused rage, was true. Jebediah was thrown forward by the force of the blast as if he had been struck by an invisible fist. His triumphant grin was replaced by a look of utter, profound shock. He took one stumbling step, his pistol falling from his limp hand, and then he collapsed in a heap in the dust, his threat extinguished forever. The 2 remaining gunmen, the one Silas had wounded and the other who had been circling near the corral, saw their leader fall. They heard the terrifying, ferocious roar of the second weapon, a weapon they had not accounted for, coming from the shadows of the house, their nerve, which had been built on the promise of easy money and the sadistic confidence of their leader, broke completely. They exchanged a single, panicked glance, fired a few wild, unaimed shots into the darkness, and fled, scrambling for their horses and disappearing into the night, leaving their wounded, screaming companion behind. A sudden, ringing silence descended on the ranch yard. It was a silence broken only by the hungry crackle of the burning barn and the sound of Silas's ragged, pain-filled breathing. Ilara let the heavy shotgun fall from her numb fingers. It hit the ground with a dull thud. She ran to Silas's side, her bare feet heedless of the sharp rocks and hot embers in the dirt. He was bleeding, his face pale and slick with sweat in the firelight. But he was alive. A wave of relief, so powerful and so absolute it made her knees weak, washed over her. She knelt beside him, helping him to sit up. Without a thought, she gripped the hem of her simple cotton nightgown and tore a long strip from it, pressing the clean fabric against his bleeding shoulder. He looked at her, his gray eyes full of pain, but also an overwhelming, staggering awe, and a love so fierce it took her breath away. "You saved me," he rasped, his voice rough. His good hand came up, his fingers gently cupping her smoke-stained cheek. "I told you to stay inside." "You also told me you would not let him hurt me," she replied, her voice trembling but strong, unwavering. "I was not going to let him hurt you, either." In that moment, illuminated by the light of their burning past and the smoldering ruins of the barn, they were equals. She was not a victim he had saved. They were partners who had saved each other. Justice, in the brutal, immediate way of the West, had been served. They had faced the worst of their demons, both the ones that haunted their minds and the ones that carried guns, and together, they had won. The fight for their lives was over. Now, the fight to build a life together could truly begin. The dawn that followed the night of the attack was unnaturally quiet, the world holding its breath. The rising sun, when it finally crested the horizon, spilled a soft, apologetic pink light across a scene of utter devastation. The great hay barn, once the proud heart of the ranch's operations, was a smoldering, blackened skeleton. Its charred ribs stood stark and skeletal against the gentle morning sky, thin wisps of gray smoke curling from the embers like departing ghosts. The ranch yard was a battlefield littered with the detritus of the fight. Spent shell casings glinted in the new light. Dark patches stained the dust, and the ground was churned and scuffed from the violent struggle. Near the corral, the body of Jebediah lay under a canvas sheet, a grim, still mound that was a testament to the night's terrible violence. The wounded gunman Silas had shot had been tied up securely to a porch post, his face a mask of sullen, grim pain as he awaited the arrival of the law. At first light, Silas had sent the young ranch hand, Ben, riding hard for Clearwater to fetch the sheriff. The physical toll of the night was immense. Silas's left shoulder was a throbbing, deep agony. The bullet wound a burning fire beneath the clean bandage Alara had fashioned. He moved stiffly, his face pale beneath its sun-darkened tan. Alara was covered in a roadmap of bruises and scrapes from the shotgun's recoil and her scramble in the dirt. Her body trembled with a bone-deep exhaustion, the last dregs of adrenaline leaving her weak and shaky. But as they stood together on the front porch, wrapped in heavy wool blankets and sipping hot, strong coffee from tin mugs, the physical pain was a distant, secondary thing. Beneath the exhaustion and the ache, a profound and absolute sense of peace had settled over them. The threat was gone. The long, suffocating shadow of Jebediah, a shadow that had stretched across years and miles to find her, had been lifted from their lives forever. They looked together at the ruins of the barn, at the black scar on their land, and they did not see it as a loss. They saw it as a cleansing fire. The past had been burned away in that terrible, beautiful inferno, leaving a clear, open space on which they could finally begin to build a future. The sheriff arrived mid-morning, riding at the head of a small posse of 4 grim-faced men. Sheriff Miller was a practical, weary-eyed man in his 50s, with a drooping mustache and a profound understanding of the harsh realities of life on the frontier. His face, as he dismounted, was a mixture of grim duty and visible surprise. The town of Clearwater had been buzzing with gossip and rumors for weeks about Silas Kane and the mysterious, damaged woman he had taken in. But the lurid whispers of the town's busybodies were one thing. The reality of a full-blown gunfight, a burned-down barn, and a dead body was another thing entirely. Silas, his left arm now held securely in a sling that Alara had meticulously prepared, met him in the yard. He gave the sheriff a clipped, factual account of the night's events, his voice low and steady, omitting the deeper, painful personal history that was the true cause of the violence. He called it an attempted robbery. 3 men who had come to steal horses and cattle. The wounded gunman, whose name was Slim, was questioned next. Eager for a lighter sentence and seeing no profit in loyalty to a dead man, he readily corroborated Silas's story. Yes, they had come to rob the place. Yes, the rancher had fought back. Finally, the sheriff turned to Alara. She stood on the porch, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her face pale but her back straight. The men of the posse stared at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. They saw the woman from the rumors. They expected a frightened, weeping creature. "Ma'am," Sheriff Miller said, his tone not unkind. "I need to hear it from you. What did you see?" Alara took a steadying breath, her eyes finding Silas's for a brief moment. He gave her a barely perceptible nod. She then looked directly at the sheriff, her gaze clear and unwavering. The timid, frightened creature who hid from the world, who could not meet a stranger's eye, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced down her own personal devil and won. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but it was as clear and steady as a church bell on a calm morning. It did not tremble. It did not waver. "They were going to kill him," she said simply. "The man you have under that sheet, his name was Jebediah. He had Mr. Cain on the ground. He was going to shoot him in the back. I got the shotgun from the house, and I shot him." She did not embellish. She did not make excuses. She stated the facts. "I did it to save Mr. Cain's life." Sheriff Miller looked from the dead outlaw, a man whose cruel face was already known to the law in other territories, to the determined young woman with the old, sad eyes, and then to the protective, wounded rancher who stood steadfastly beside her. He was a man who understood violence, and he understood survival. He did not see the sordid scandal the town had imagined. He saw a story as old as the land itself, a story of desperation, of protection, of two people fighting to hold on to the small piece of the world they called their own. He nodded slowly. A final decision made, he turned to one of his deputies. "Cut him loose," he said, gesturing to the wounded gunman. "And get him on a horse. We will take him back for trial. The other one is a clear case of self-defense." The law, for once, was on their side. As the posse rode away, taking the dead and the living criminals with them, a final, definitive chapter of their lives closed for good. The weeks that followed were dedicated to healing and to rebuilding, both of their bodies and of their home. Alara tended to Silas's wound with a devotion that went far beyond the duties of a nurse. Her touch, which had once been so hesitant and feather-light, was no longer just comforting. It was intimate, and at times, almost possessive. She would change his dressings with a quiet, fierce concentration, her brow furrowed. In the mornings, because he could not do it himself, she would lather his face with soap and carefully shave him with his straight razor, her small hands surprisingly steady. She helped him dress, her fingers brushing against the warm, solid skin of his chest as she buttoned his shirts. Her hands moved over him with a growing familiarity that spoke of a love that had been tested by fire and sealed in blood. He, in turn, leaned on her, allowing himself to be vulnerable in a way he never had before, not even with his first wife. He let her see his pain, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the moments when the weakness from the wound and the loss of blood overwhelmed him. He allowed her to care for him, to support him, and in doing so, in letting her be strong for him, he gave her the greatest gift of all, the undeniable proof of her own strength and worth. Together, side by side, they began to reclaim their ranch from the ashes. The old hand, Gus, and the young Ben, who had been fiercely, almost violently, loyal after the attack, worked tirelessly alongside them. The town could whisper and judge all it wanted. On this ranch, a new family had been forged in the crucible of that night. They worked from sunup to sundown, clearing the charred debris of the burned barn. The shared labor, the sweat and the strain of it, was a communal act of defiance, of reclaiming their home from the violence that had violated it. There was a sense of purpose and camaraderie on the ranch that had been absent for 2 long, grief-stricken years. The silence of the place was no longer heavy with loss. It was filled now with the sounds of hammers and saws, and sometimes with the sound of Alara's soft, quiet laughter. With the external threats now gone, vanquished and buried, the final, internal walls between them crumbled into dust. Their desire for each other, which had been sublimated by fear and grief and the harsh demands of survival, rose to the surface, a powerful, undeniable current. It was a desire that had been deepened by respect and tempered by a profound, intimate understanding of each other's fragility. They had seen the most broken parts of each other, and had loved what they saw. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together by the fire in the main room. The hearth, which had been cold and empty for so long, now crackled with a cheerful blaze. The silence between them was no longer one of caution or sorrow, but of a deep, comfortable intimacy. He sat in his large armchair, and she sat on the braided rug at his feet, her head resting against his good knee. He reached down with his right hand and took hers, his thumb stroking gently over her knuckles. "Ilara," he said, his voice low and serious in the quiet room. He waited until she tilted her head back to look up at him. "What we have, this thing between us, I want it to be permanent. I want you to be my wife." It was not a flowery, romantic proposal. There were no pretty words or grand declarations. It was a simple, heartfelt statement of fact, as solid and as real as the stone of the hearth. For him, it was the ultimate vow of protection and belonging he could offer. It was his way of telling her that she would never be alone again. For Ilara, the words were almost too much to comprehend. Wife. The word echoed in her mind, foreign and beautiful, a title of respect, of love, of true partnership. It was everything she had been told she could never be, everything her past had supposedly made her unworthy of. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the sight of his strong, beloved face in the firelight. But for the first time in her life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Silas, yes." He leaned down, and she rose to her knees to meet him. He pulled her into his arms, his good arm wrapping around her, holding her tight. Their kiss was not the hesitant, sorrowful exploration of their first. It was a deep, passionate confirmation of their future, a sealing of the vow he had just made. Their love, in the days that followed, found its ultimate physical expression. It did not come in a rush of desperate, hungry passion, but with the same reverence and profound tenderness that had come to define their entire relationship. One night, after the dishes were done and the house was quiet, he took her hand and led her from the kitchen, not to her own small room, but to his. It was the master bedroom, the room that had once been a sacred shrine to his grief, a room she had never dared to enter. The act of him leading her across its threshold was a sacred act in itself. He was not just inviting her into his bed. He was inviting her into his life, into the space his heart had kept guarded for so long. He undressed her slowly, his eyes full of a gentle awe in the soft lantern light. His gaze memorized every pale scar on her body, not as marks of shame, but as a testament to her survival, the roadmap of the incredible woman he loved. He bent his head and pressed his lips to a thin, silvery scar on her ribs, a silent act of worship, of healing. When she stood before him, all her history laid bare. She saw his own scarred, work-hardened body, and she did the same for him. Her gentle, accepting touch was a balm to his own lonely soul. Their lovemaking was a slow, quiet discovery, a reclaiming of their own bodies from the traumas of their pasts. It was an act of profound, healing intimacy, a silent conversation where their bodies spoke a language of absolute trust. In every gentle touch, in every soft kiss, they told each other, "You are safe here. You are loved. You are whole." It was the final healing. It was the ultimate act of trust that sealed their bond. Two broken souls making each other whole. The story does not end with a wedding ceremony in a church full of judging townspeople. Their vows had already been made, in a kitchen full of broken promises, and sealed by a fire in the dead of night. Their new life began not with the words of a preacher, but with the rising of the sun on the next day. It ends, instead, many months later, in the full, glorious bloom of the late spring. A new, larger barn, smelling of fresh-cut pine and sweat and honest labor, now stood where the old one had burned. The scattered cattle, most of them, had been rounded up and brought home, and the ranch was more prosperous than ever. On a bright, clear afternoon, Silas was in the high pasture, teaching Ilara how to properly ride a horse, not just sit astride one like a sack of flour. She was a natural. She sat tall and proud on a gentle bay mare, her laughter bright and free as she urged the horse from a trot into a canter. She flew across the field, which was green with new grass and dotted with the vibrant colors of wildflowers, her hair coming undone from its bun to stream behind her like a banner. Silas watched her from his own horse, a tall, steady buckskin. The slow, small smile that touched his lips reached all the way to his eyes, erasing the last traces of the grieving, haunted man he had once been. The pain of his past, of Sarah and Thomas, would always be a part of him, just as the scars of her past would always be a part of her. But those scars no longer defined them. They had not erased their pasts. They had simply built a future that was strong enough to hold them. They had learned to love each other not in spite of their scars, but because of them. Later that evening, they sat together on the wide porch swing he had built, watching the sun dip below the horizon, setting the western sky ablaze with color. The vast, harsh landscape that had once symbolized their loneliness now represented their shared kingdom, their hard-won sanctuary. Ilara, now Silas's wife in every way that mattered, leaned her head on his shoulder, her body relaxed and at ease in a way that would have been unimaginable a year ago. She was no longer the woman who believed she was not worth a job, the woman who expected to be cast aside at any moment. She was the mistress of this ranch, the co-author of this life, the fierce protector of its heart. Silas put his arm around her, holding her close as the first stars began to prick the darkening sky. No grand declarations were needed between them. Their love existed in the quiet, steady rhythm of their life together, in the shared meals, in the silent understanding that passed between them with a single glance, in the fierce, unbreakable resilience of their joined spirits. He pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head, and they watched the last sliver of sun disappear, content in the peaceful, ordinary, and extraordinary life they had fought so hard to build together. The cowboy would not let her leave, and in staying, she had not only found her home, she had brought him back to life. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.